there's sort of four components to thinking about trauma-informed lawyering in real time. So understanding trauma and how it impacts your client, we talked about that. But adjustments, this is kind of where the rubber meets the road. Adjusting what you expect in the attorney-client relationship and adapting case strategy, and then preventing and addressing and transforming vicarious trauma. There's a lot packed into that: preventing, addressing, and transforming. And again, we're not going to get to vicarious trauma in this module. Well, I should say we will talk a little bit about, not re-traumatizing clients, which sometimes people can think of as vicarious trauma, but what we really mean most of the time when we're saying vicarious trauma is the effect on the attorney in this context. When you're like a third person, you didn't witness the traumatic event, you're hearing about it after the fact, but it still has an effect on us. So I wish we could always cover that, but we're not going to today. Okay, here's some nitty gritty of what can happen. What does trauma, how could it manifest in a client's conduct? So clients might be unresponsive, and this could be happening for a variety of reasons, but one very, very good reason, one sort of self-defense mechanism kicking in reason, is avoiding re-traumatization. And that's huge, right? This happens at Free to Thrive. We'll get significant progress on someone's case, and then we start to get into the really difficult things to talk about, and that person is not making the appointments anymore. And you always kind of wonder, okay, is there something going on for them where they're protecting themselves from this process? Another thing is just readjusting expectations around how we get stories. So memories, I think generally aren't always structurally organized, but that's particularly true when you're dealing with memories that are housed during traumatic events where the body is responding in a survival mode. So there might be difficulty forming linear narratives. And some of how you can deal with that is hold things really loosely when you're interviewing clients. Like, you are a detective putting puzzle pieces together, activating your curiosity, coming at things at the same thing from different angles at different times. Like maybe one day your client's going to remember a part of their life that's going to be relatively blank for them another day. So if something's hard, you can just say, we're going to come back to that later. Coming at it from a non-linear perspective, right? A sensory perspective. This can be really helpful with interviewing where there was trauma that the client was experiencing in the moment. They might remember sensations, setting, what the room looked like, more than they might remember, this thing happened and then this person came up to me and said this, and right after that I did this. So that kind of linear storytelling that I think lawyers are both very used to, and that we know we need to present to courts in order to demonstrate credibility. We have to be really flexible with that. Like, how do we construct a linear story out of memories that might not come that way? Jamie, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, and you kind of hit on it at the end, so I was even questioning if I needed to say anything. But this idea of how am I going to put it together in that interview? I mean, it's so hard as lawyers, because I know I am, and I know most of the lawyers I know, we're all very linear people, and it's like we want the client to say, what happened? Like, tell me the next thing and the next thing, and it is so challenging to get that type of linear narrative from a client. And if you approach the process looking for a linear narrative, it'll be really frustrating. And so letting go of that and just letting the client share what they remember, still guiding them through and keeping them focused, but understanding that a lot of your job is going to be to take what they tell you and reorganize it and structure it and tell it in a way that makes sense to a court or to a prosecutor, but it's not going to come out that way initially.
Yeah. And, there's also, in terms of like vacature specifically with trauma-informed interviewing, I think there's ways to soften. Like, I often find myself, based on what I'm getting from the client, saying things when I'm kind of typing my notes, like, to the best of my recollection, this is what I think happened next. And you can soften it if you're like, well, this is a declaration, I'm submitting it to the court. We don't have to always use precise language. I think we can be upfront with the fact that things are hazy, and it actually makes a lot of sense when you learn more about trauma that they would be hazy. Inconsistencies, I want to talk about this a little bit. I have found it extremely helpful. This is just my tactic for dealing with inconsistencies, is I address them very upfront with clients typically. And the way that I do that is by first framing what I think an inconsistency is. because I don't want to ever communicate to the client that I think that they're lying to me or that I don't trust them. So telling them, here's some things I've learned about memory and trauma. It completely makes sense. Last time, I think you said this time you're saying this, and I want to like help us weave our way toward what you think is the most accurate representation of what happened to you, but I don't expect you to always know. And I don't want you to think that me asking you this question again is because I think you were withholding that information from me. So I tend to take a very direct path. If I notice inconsistencies, that's just one tactic. And again, what I'm hedging against is a client thinking that I'm judging them or that I'm grilling them over an inconsistency. I want to explain why I'm asking again. Sometimes inconsistencies do come from shifts in the narrative, and I think that can be on a spectrum all the way from like, this person is struggling with this thing that they did or said, and they have some shame about telling you, all the way towards sort of a more proactive version of deception where like they don't have the trust with you to tell you the real story yet. And none of those things are deal breakers in our representation of clients, right? And I think over time we just build trust. And so I guess in the same way that we have to hold the linear storytelling lightly, we have to hold inconsistencies lightly and figure out how to return to them and how to clarify and what's going on with the client. One thing that can also help is addressing that head on. If you do feel like there might be some proactive hiding of the truth that's happening, to say, hey, I really want you to know, like, I'm so privileged to work on this case with you. I really want you to get what you deserve out of this. And I just have a sense that like, maybe you're hesitant to tell me this. And I just want you to know that I'm going to stay with you. Like this, I have this case, like, I'm not going to bail on you no matter what you tell me right now. If you do want to tell me more information. So coming at it from some of those angles where you're taking a really relational tact to addressing inconsistencies and the reasons for them. But again, it's really hard to tell, and your gut might be wrong. You might think this person's lying to me and they might not be, or vice versa. So try to handle that with, a fair degree of humility and asking the client to help you figure out what's going on because you're a team together. Just emotions, like clients can be easily overwhelmed or upset and tearful. Sometimes a really flat affect, like showing no emotion, can also be the response. I think, our culture is weird about both things, right? If someone is presenting emotionally in the midst of an interview, we might think, oh gosh, I shouldn't have asked that question, or like, that's the worst thing I could have done, because we think the tears are a problem. But if we're taking a trauma-informed lens, we don't know what the tears are. We have to ask the client, what's going on for you in this moment? Like, do you need a moment, or just wait, give them space. Same thing with the little emotions. I think culturally we can interpret that as like, this person has no emotional content related to this memory or this relationship that they're talking about, and we can judge that really quickly, but it's actually a trauma response to like disengage and disassociate. So that could be what's going on. So all of this can be summed up in like practice non-judgment and curiosity, but how we do that is really the nitty-gritty. And lastly, just knowing the client might have things going on where in the interview that they're having with you, they're actually thinking about something else, right? Their housing or daycare for their kid, something going on with their health. Those things always are going to be more urgent than whatever legal thing is happening, as long as the legal thing is not taking place tomorrow. Like, I've got a hearing tomorrow, So just being really mindful of that. And like, it's okay if an interview needs to be cut short or needs to be rescheduled. This is actually something I'm learning. Like, I think I've been overly deferential sometimes to clients in these moments where like, I really sense something's going on and I know they're concerned about something else because they've started just talking about that other thing. And in those moments, I've tended to be like, hey, do you still want to have this, interview about your vacatur petition? Do you want to reschedule? And if they say, no, I still want to do it, I've kind of gone forward with that. And later I've realized, I think sometimes I had enough information already to say, this isn't a great day to dive into this. And let's just circle back and take another shot at this another time, And so I think the client has the authority to say, you know what, today is not my day. I don't want to talk about this right now. And so do you as their lawyer, because your partner is in this. And so if you don't think that, it's going to be serving to actually push their case forward to do the interview that day, it's 100% okay to say, let's just take a minute, let's sit with our feelings and let's maybe do this on another day. So that's a lot of judgment calls, and it's really hard to say what's the right thing, but I guess I felt like I had gone too far in one direction of subverting my gut instincts because I was so concerned about putting the client in control of that moment. But there's complicated sociological things happening where I think the client doesn't want to disappoint the attorney because they showed up to this meeting. And so you just have to kind of weigh those things and think about it holistically. So these are all things that can crop up in interviewing. Here, attorney adjustments, this is a little bit broader than interviewing, but I'm just going to focus on the stuff that pertains to interview. So if you know that your client might not show up to an interview, just having other things that you can work on so that you don't feel resentful of that, knowing that's going to be a reality to working with folks who've been through trauma. It looks like we lost Jen. I didn't get a chance to say bye to her, but yeah, making extra time for in-person interviews, also just knowing we're going to talk about difficult subject matter. If you're going to try to wedge this into a half an hour, that might not be the best scheduling decision for this kind of interviewing, right? And then just continuing to practice compassion and common humanity when things happen in the interview that make your job harder or even just annoy you. So those are all adjustments that the attorney can make. Okay. We have a large list of do's and don'ts that I tinkered around with and thought about putting into slides, and then ultimately decided I'm just going to send those things to you all afterwards. So you're going to get a copy of our manual, which has a few pages of do's and don'ts for interviewing. But this is a summary that captures a lot of them. So I'm just going to go through because this is the thing we're going to spend a little more time on here. Not expecting your client to be ready to share traumatic experiences in the first interview. Again, this is something to hold loosely, right? And some people will be ready. Some people meet with you and they're like, great, I got an attorney. I want to get into this. I am ready. I'm good to go. Other people, there's going to need to be more trust building. I think that's very, very dependent on the individual person. Only asking for the information that you need. This one is so important. I find this really hard personally because I'm wearing my curiosity hat when I'm working with clients. And in some ways that's a real asset, right? To turn on curiosity mode and just get curious about someone's life. It can also lead you down this path of asking questions that you don't need to know the answer to. And it ultimately can have the outcome of being much more invasive than what you intended to do. So to really be I want to encourage everyone to approach client interviewing with curiosity, and also check your curiosity as you go. Is this something I need to know to give this client the best representation I can give them in this matter? Asking the person what they can recall right now. This goes back to what we talked about with, the linear storytelling. This takes the pressure off. I've really found this to be a very helpful question to just say hey, I want to take a pass at talking about this thing that we touched on last time or that you just mentioned to me. Can you just tell me what you remember in this moment? It doesn't have to be the whole story. It doesn't have to be super linked up to these other things we just talked about. What comes to mind when I ask you about this? Asking about emotions and impressions, that can help people jog what they recall from a moment. This next point about how we meet with clients, I think there's some nuance here. One thing that the pandemic has taught us at Free to Thrive is there's a lot of accessibility pros to meeting online over Zoom or via phone call. But there's a lot of cons too, right? When you're not meeting in person, you don't get to build the same kinds of bonds and do the same kind of trust building. You don't get to read body language, especially if it's a phone call, but Zoom can be hard with body language too. So a lot of little cues that we don't get. Again, I think this is very client dependent. If you've got a client with, 2 kids that they've got custody of and they're running around all the time and they're busy and they're solo parenting, it might be much harder to deal with their case if you think you can only have in-person meetings to move their case forward. That might just delay things. So this is a really tough one because there's a lot of pros and cons on each end, but I think this is one where the client can take the lead, and I think hopefully the attorney can adapt to what the client wants for how meetings happen. Asking what they felt or saw at the time. Again, this is back to sort of the sensory impressions thing. That can be more helpful for memory than just saying what happened next. Using grounding techniques, we've got a slide on this coming up. You could do this for yourself and you can do this with the client. So grounding techniques are meant to take folks out of whatever stress or anxiety is ramping up in their body and bring them back to the present moment. I have this little rock at my desk that's just like a heavy rock. And sometimes when I'm on the phone with clients, I just put it in my hand and I just go like this so I can listen to them and it brings me back into my body. So there's just a million grounding techniques that you can do. And again, we have another slide on that, but that's very, very helpful for both us and clients. Practice non-judgment and compassion. That's one of our umbrella things. Oh man, this is so important. Don't shame the client for their choices, past or present. I think this can be really, really challenging to us, especially when we don't intend to shame and when something that a client is choosing to do, particularly in the present, is like, from our perspective, not what they need in their life. But we have to always like maintain that value of the client is autonomous and their dignity and their autonomy means that they make their own decisions and they are on a path, they are on a journey, just like all of us are. And we all start at different places and we all have different challenges to work through. So I think where I can see very well-intentioned lawyers stepping over the line with this is when we're trying to exert control because we care about the client and we want them to like not act a certain way that we see as self-destructive or undermining their goals in life. But that can be interpreted by a client as shaming them. And what really matters is how they're going to receive that, not what you meant to say. So to keep in mind what's happening on the other end for them, that's part of centering them too. How are they going to receive this as opposed to why do I want to say this, you know? And this can be super tough. I don't want to sugarcoat it. Like, I think sometimes we're dealing with clients in even emergency situations that can be very, very dangerous. But it just tends to be the case for most people that confrontation and judgment around that is not going to help them find a different path, even if they want to eventually. And even if confrontation would help them, it's probably not their attorney who's the person who needs to do that, right? Lastly, I just want to highlight, oh, please do, Jamie.
Yeah, and I mean, where this is going to come up in vacature, I mean, we see what a lot of what Allison's talking about is those of you with working with this population day in and day out, there will be times where in the present moment, you know, things are going to come up, and some of it may come up with pro bono lawyers, but I think a little bit less so. But in the vacature context, even how you ask a question of a client, there could be subtle judgment layered into the question itself. And just be really mindful of the language you use of, you know, why did you do that versus help me understand at that moment, you know, what was your thought process, or, you know, tell me more about that. You just ways to, you know, kind of take any sort of opinion out of your questions and instead just let the client tell their story as best you can. And sometimes it's really hard to do, and and there's going to be moments where you're sitting there, you hear a client story and you're going to be like, why did you do that? Like, their trafficker has been awful to them. They finally get away from their trafficker. I've had numbers of clients who finally get away from their trafficker and they get into a program, which is so hard to do. They are like in the program or on their way to the program, and they decide to go back to the trafficker. Like, this is a common fact pattern in these vacature cases. And you're sitting there being like, why would you do that? You worked so hard to get away from that person, and why did you go back? And there's just other ways to ask them about that experience without saying what you might be thinking in that moment. And that's where those two bullets, practice non-judgment, compassion, and don't shame the client, like, are tied directly together of, of instead asking, in that moment when you decided to go back, can you help me understand what was that like for you? What was it that brought you back to them after the things that they had done to you? Or there's ways to just kind of soften how you ask that question. But there will be moments where you just are struggling to understand, and just find ways to ask it in a more compassionate, non-judgmental way. Also want to just go back to only asking the information you need. Ground yourself in the elements of vacature. You know what those elements are. It's a very simple statute to understand. There's only 5 elements to a vacature, what it takes for vacature. So even have a post-it note or something next to, as you're talking to your client, reminding yourself what those elements are, so that if you get off track, or if they're going down a road and you're like, do I really need to know this? And when it will come up, one way it will come up, it'll come up in a lot of different ways, because your clients are going to go on all these tangents. They're part of the non-linear story, is that they're going to go off left and right, and your job is to kind of bring them back to the story that you're trying to tell. But I found that sometimes they'll start to tell you these really traumatic things that happened to them. Really serious violence and sexual violence and all these things. And this is now going to be super triggering and re-traumatizing for your client to tell you all these things. And sometimes they'll feel like they're supposed to just tell you everything, right? And there are times when you don't need to know that level of detail to be able to tell the story. I mean, that could be a single sentence of the petition of, my trafficker was extremely violent with me and, abused me on several occasions, or something, as opposed to very graphic details of what happened to them. And so there's an opportunity to find a way to respectfully, pause the client or interrupt them to say, wait, hold on for 1 second. You're telling me a lot of really graphic details. And I imagine that really telling me that it's hard. It's really hard to talk about, because those are really awful things that happen to you. I think that, we don't need that level of detail to be able to tell the court what happened to you. So, and I'm having trouble on the spot, coming up with exactly how I'd say it, but, find a way to kind of pause the conversation and share with them that you don't need that level of detail, and to kind of take it one level back, or just redirect them away from that story to kind of the bigger picture or something, so that they don't need to tell you all those things, and sharing that, that's a lot for them to tell you, and they don't always have to. And if you can always say, if I need more detail, I'll ask you follow-up questions, but don't feel like you have to tell me every detail. It's okay if you don't.
Thanks, Jamie. That's all really helpful. I want to also just highlight, back to what Jamie was saying about the shame piece, and really being mindful of how we craft questions. I think there's also options for how you come into the question, how you frame it. And so one thing I do very often in interviewing with clients is I just remind them, I'll tell them, I don't like that the statute necessitates that we prove this thing. I think that's messed up, but it's a part of the law. And that's why I have to ask you these questions. And the reason I take a step back to say that is because I don't want them to think, one of the elements is distance from the trafficking scheme, which I think is a very victim blamey element of the law. You have to demonstrate that you're beyond this before you get vacature relief. And I just don't like that element. And so I tell clients I don't like it, but I have to interview them about it for us to get this form of relief. So there's a lot of ways to come at reducing the propensity for the client to think, because you're asking certain questions, that they're being shamed. I want to actually pause and address Cindy's question while we're on this slide, because I think it fits right in here. So I'm going to read it from the chat. Cindy asked, or just said she'd like to know how we interview and ask questions about a client's convictions and how they got started with trafficking without re-traumatizing them. So one thing that, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is reduce traumatization. I think the reality is that this is a potentially traumatizing experience because our legal system isn't trauma informed. And that is just a really difficult reality. If we had a trauma informed legal system, I mean, I think the most trauma-informed way this could happen is that prosecutors' offices would go back through their files and proactively identify victims and wipe their record without that person having to do anything, right? But we're so far from that. Not only do you have to raise your hand and say, yes, I'm a victim, or I was a victim, you also have to tell your story in some way. And that's a lot of sharing that I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where asking someone to disclose that can be completely trauma-informed. But at the same time, like the clients know that, and they still think this is worth it for them, right? And so you're collaborators in this imperfect system. And so I always lean back on that when I'm like dealing with the harder questions, to tell them like, I apologize. Like, I think this is really messed up that we have to talk about this. Like, I don't want to bring you back to that place, but this is something that the law requires. And do you feel like within those confines of what the law requires, do you feel up for talking about this right now? Do you want to wait until our next meeting? Like, giving lots of options is one way to soften those things. But I think at the end of the day, we're asking traumatizing questions. I mean, that's a really tough reality. So I think you've hit on one of the biggest tensions in what we're doing, Cindy, which is that we're trying to be trauma-informed in a non-trauma-informed system that in a very real way doesn't allow us to follow through all the way on that promise. But to me, this also goes back to client autonomy. I mean, it can be so empowering and healing for clients to clean up their record. And this is the process that's necessary to do this. And if ultimately the client experiences their interactions with you as a partner, someone who's on their side and who has some legal expertise, who's guiding them through this process, the content of the process actually becomes a little bit less important. So continuing to, bring the client back to like why we're doing this and what you hope for them. Erin, I know another thing she does that I think is really lovely is she tries to always end on a positive note by asking the client more about their life goals and what they're excited about, or asking them about, like something cool that's happening for their kid or whatever might be, getting them into a headspace toward the end of the interview that's not so stuck in like telling their trauma story. So at the end of the day, I think all of these techniques that we're talking about are ways to try to ask the hard questions without re-traumatizing people. But I don't think we can ever guarantee that that's not going to happen. And I lean really heavy into like over communication and over disclosure to the client, because I want them to know exactly what's going on, exactly why I'm asking these questions, and also for them to know they can hit the brakes at any time. Like they can take a pause, they can tell me I don't want to talk about that right now. All of that is 100% okay. More than okay. I want the client to tell me when that's going on for them, So yeah, trying to do our best in a very imperfect system.